June 8, 1945, 3:47 a.m. Holding facility, outskirts of Manchester, England. Darkness pressed against the small window high in the concrete wall, turning glass into mirror that reflected only the cell's interior. 4 metal cots, 1 bucket for sanitation, walls that wept with dampness despite being hundreds of miles from any coast. Clara Bauer lay rigid on her cot, eyes open despite exhaustion that made her bones ache, listening to Inga Schmidt's ragged breathing from the cot across the narrow space. Neither had slept more than fragments since their arrival 3 days ago. Snatches of unconsciousness, interrupted by the sounds of other prisoners coughing, weeping, or screaming from nightmares that Clara understood too well, because she'd lived through the same events that generated them. She was 34 years old. Before conscription, she'd worked as a librarian in Hamburg, organizing books and helping students locate research materials. The Wehrmacht had drafted her into administrative services in 1943. Filing, typing, maintaining records of supply movements and personnel transfers. When British forces captured her unit outside Bremen on May 21, 1945, 18 days ago, she'd expected execution or conditions that would make execution seem merciful. Instead, she'd gotten transport to England and this: a converted factory with cells carved from storage rooms, minimal light, inadequate heating, and the constant sound of metal doors clanging in corridors she couldn't see. The door was solid steel, painted institutional gray, with a small window at eye level, 6 inches by 4 inches, that was covered from the outside by a sliding metal plate. When the plate was open, guards could look in without prisoners seeing out. When the plate was closed, the cell became tomb, sealed and lightless except for the high window that provided no view except sky. Clara had counted. The plate opened approximately every 2 hours during daytime, presumably for security checks. But during night hours, the timing was irregular, unpredictable. Each opening accompanied by the scrape of metal on metal that made her heart pound even when she was expecting it. The door terrified her. Not the door itself. It was just steel and hinges and a lock mechanism that clicked when turned, but what the door represented. Barrier between her and whatever existed in the corridors beyond. Barrier that she couldn't control or see through or predict when it would open. Doors in Wehrmacht facilities had meant the same thing. When they opened, someone was coming to take you somewhere, to make you do something, to deliver news that was never good. Doors opening meant loss of whatever fragile control you'd maintained during the time doors stayed closed. Beside her, Inga stirred, coughing again. Wet, productive cough that had been getting worse for 2 days. Inga was 28, from Berlin, had worked Wehrmacht communications. She'd been sick even before capture, but the damp cell and inadequate blankets had transformed minor respiratory infection into something more serious. Her breathing was labored, occasional wheezing, suggesting her lungs were filling with fluid. Clara had tried to get guards' attention during the previous day's checks, pointing to Inga and trying to convey sick and doctor through gestures since none of the guards spoke German and no interpreter had been provided. The guards had nodded, made notes on clipboards, but no medical attention had arrived. Clara listened to Inga's breathing, counting the wet rattles, trying to remember what she'd learned from her brother who'd been a medical student before the war. Pneumonia, probably. Serious without treatment. Potentially lethal if the infection progressed far enough, but she had no medication, no way to help, except to give Inga her own blanket, which she'd already done, leaving herself shivering through nights that were cold enough to see breath even in June. Footsteps in the corridor. Heavy boots, multiple sets, moving fast rather than the measured patrol pace Clara had learned to distinguish. Her entire body tensed, muscles locking despite exhaustion. Fast footsteps meant urgency. Urgency meant something had changed. Change was always dangerous. The footsteps stopped outside their door. Metal scraped metal as the viewing plate slid open. Clara couldn't see who was looking in. The angle was wrong from her cot. But she heard breathing, heard someone speaking rapid English to a companion, heard keys rattling, then shouting. Loud, urgent, commanding. Open the door! Open the door now! The words were English, but the tone was universal. Emergency. Immediate action required. No time for delay. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Open the door meant they were coming in. coming in at 3:47 a.m., shouting commands, moving with urgency that suggested violence or removal or something terrible enough to require immediate action rather than waiting for morning. If this makes you question everything you thought you knew, you're paying attention. Subscribe now. These stories deserve to be heard. For 12 years, Clara had absorbed propaganda about British treatment of German prisoners. The messaging had been specific. British forces executed prisoners or worked them to death, but first they extracted information through interrogation that was brutal and systematic. Women prisoners faced particular dangers. The propaganda had been carefully vague about specifics, while making implications clear enough that imagination filled gaps with horrors. Propaganda didn't need to articulate. The propaganda about nighttime removals had been explicit. Clara had attended briefings in March 1945 as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany and capture became increasingly likely. The officer conducting the session, Major Reinhardt, whose face remained vivid though she'd forgotten his first name, had been grimly detailed. British interrogation occurs at night, when screams are less noticeable and when exhaustion makes resistance difficult. They will remove prisoners from cells without warning, without explanation, conducting interrogation in isolated rooms where violations of Geneva Conventions can occur without witnesses. He'd distributed information about resisting interrogation, techniques for withstanding pain, methods for providing false information that sounded credible, instructions for attempting suicide if interrogation became unbearable. Clara had memorized the information despite hoping never to need it, the details burning into memory like brand marks. Pressure points to target if escape became necessary, arteries to cut if death became preferable, phrases to repeat that might buy time by confusing interrogators. The 3 days since arrival at this facility had confirmed parts of that narrative while contradicting others. The interrogation sessions had occurred, 2 per day, morning and afternoon, conducted by officers who asked questions about her unit, her duties, her knowledge of military operations. But the interrogations had been bureaucratic rather than brutal. Questions asked through interpreter, answers recorded on forms, no violence or threats of violence. The sessions were uncomfortable, being questioned by enemies about information she didn't possess, but they weren't torture in any recognizable form. The conditions in the cell were harsh, but not deliberately cruel. Minimal space, cold, damp, inadequate blankets. But food arrived twice daily, plain but adequate portions, and water was available from a tap in the corridor that guards filled cups from during their rounds. The treatment was uncomfortable but survivable, which made it ambiguous rather than clearly aligned with propaganda warnings. Now, listening to guards shouting, "Open the door," at 3:47 a.m., Clara's mind supplied the missing context. This was the moment propaganda had prepared her for. Daytime processing had been preliminary. Nighttime removal was when actual interrogation began. The brutal kind, the kind that happened in rooms without documentation, the kind that left prisoners broken or dead. The door opened with a metallic shriek that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. Light flooded in from the corridor, harsh fluorescent brightness that made Clara blink and shield her eyes. 3 British soldiers stood in the doorway, backlit so she couldn't see their faces clearly. Large men, they all seemed large to her now, well-fed and solid in ways that made her conscious of her own diminishment from months of inadequate rations. The central figure spoke in rapid English. "Medical emergency. We need to move the sick prisoner. Now." His tone was still urgent, but the words, filtered through Clara's limited English comprehension, suggested something other than interrogation. Medical? Sick prisoner? Inge? One of the men entered the cell, moving directly toward Inge's cot. He bent down, placed his hand on Inge's forehead, checking temperature, Clara realized, then spoke to his companions. "She's burning up. Fever, respiratory distress. We need to get her to the infirmary immediately." Another man entered, this one carrying what looked like a stretcher or folded blanket. They worked together with practiced efficiency, lifting Inge from her cot. She was barely conscious, didn't protest or resist, and positioning her on the stretcher. Inge's face was flushed, sweat visible on her forehead despite the cell's cold, breathing shallow and rapid. Clara found her voice. "What are you doing? Where are you taking her?" The questions came out in German, Useless since the guards clearly didn't understand. But the desperation was universal enough that one of them responded in English with gestures, pointing to Inga, then making a motion that suggested medical treatment, then pointing down the corridor. They carried Inga out, movements quick but careful, supporting her weight properly to avoid jarring her. The third guard remained in the doorway, not entering, but not closing the door either. He spoke to Clara in English that was slow and deliberate. "Your friend is very sick. Pneumonia, probably. Dr. Foster will treat her. You stay here. Someone will explain in the morning." Then he closed the door. The lock clicked. The viewing plate slid shut. The light from the corridor disappeared, leaving Clara alone in darkness that felt different from the darkness that had existed before the door opened. This darkness carried the absence of Inga's breathing, the absence of her presence, the uncertainty of whether taking Inga to medical care was genuine assistance, or whether medical treatment was euphemism for something else. Clara sat on her cot, wrapped in both blankets, now that Inga wasn't using hers, trying to process what had just happened. The guards had shouted, "Open the door," with urgency that had terrified her. They'd entered at nearly 4 a.m., with speed and purpose that suggested violence. But they'd taken Inga to medical care because pneumonia was emergency requiring immediate treatment. The gap between expectation and reality was so wide, Clara couldn't parse it immediately. She lay down, pulling blankets to her chin, and discovered she was crying. Not from fear exactly. The acute terror had passed when guards left without taking her, but from exhaustion and confusion, and the whiplash of certainty answered with completely different outcome. She'd been certain they were coming for interrogation. Instead, they'd been coming for medical rescue. The difference was profound, but hard to process through fog of sleep deprivation and chronic stress. Morning arrived with weak light through the high window. Clara had slept perhaps 90 minutes total. Fractured sleep interrupted by replaying the door opening, the shouted commands, the guards carrying Inga away. She sat up when footsteps approached, when the viewing plate slid open, when breakfast was delivered through a slot in the door, tin plate with porridge, slice of bread, mug of weak tea. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing, waiting for someone to explain what had happened to Inga. The explanation came at 9:30, delivered by a British woman in auxiliary service uniform who spoke German with a Swiss accent. The woman was maybe 60, with steel-gray hair and an expression of professional neutrality. "I am Mrs. Dorothy Hughes, liaison officer. Your cellmate, Inga Schmidt, was taken to infirmary at 03:47 hours. She has bacterial pneumonia, high fever, significant respiratory distress. Dr. Margaret Foster is treating her with antibiotics and oxygen therapy. The prognosis is uncertain, but treatment has begun." Clara tried to formulate questions through the confusion. Why at night? Why the shouting? Why the urgency? Hughes finished the question. "Because pneumonia can deteriorate rapidly. Dr. Foster was conducting late rounds, checking on a different patient, when she reviewed the medical notes from daytime observations. Your gestures about Inga being sick had been noted but not prioritized. The guard who recorded them thought you were asking for extra blankets, not reporting medical emergency. When Dr. Foster read the actual notes and cross-referenced with cell assignments, she realized Schmidt hadn't been seen by medical staff despite showing symptoms of serious respiratory illness. She ordered immediate extraction for emergency treatment. The shouting was Sergeant William Davies communicating with other guards to open the cell door quickly. He wasn't shouting at you. He was shouting at Corporal Fletcher to move faster with keys because medical emergency required speed. I understand the shouting was frightening, but the urgency was about saving Schmidt's life, not about threatening yours. The explanation made logical sense, but required complete reinterpretation of the previous night's events. The door opening hadn't been threat. It had been rescue. The shouted commands hadn't been aggression. They'd been coordination under time pressure. The guards taking aims hadn't been removing her for interrogation. They'd been transporting her to medical care that might save her life. Hughes continued, "You will be moved to a different cell today. 2-person cells are being converted to single occupancy while Schmidt is in infirmary. This isn't punishment. It's logistics. You'll be informed of Schmidt's condition daily. Any questions?" Clara had hundreds of questions, but only one that mattered. Will she survive? Dr. Foster gives her 60% chance with proper treatment, better than 0%, which is what she had in a cold cell without medication. Now, pack your belongings. Someone will move you within the hour. The belongings consisted of the 2 blankets and nothing else. Clara folded them carefully, creating a neat bundle that represented the sum total of her material possessions. She sat on her cot, holding the bundle, waiting for the door to open again. When it opened, at 10:15, with the same metallic shriek, she flinched despite knowing the opening was scheduled and non-threatening. The sound of the door opening had become associated with terror from the previous night, and unlearning that association would require time and repetition. Sergeant Davies stood in the doorway, the same man who'd shouted, "Open the door," hours earlier. In daylight, through eyes that were less panicked, Clara could see him more clearly. 40-something, with weathered face and gray threading through brown hair, stocky build, suggesting decades of physical work. His expression was neutral but not hostile. He gestured for her to follow, speaking in English she didn't understand, but with tone that suggested routine rather than threat. She followed him down the corridor, her first view of the facility beyond her cell. The corridor was concrete, painted institutional gray, lined with doors identical to the one she'd been locked behind. Some had viewing plates open, showing glimpses of other women in cells. Some were closed, sealed completely. The corridor ended in a T-junction where Davies turned right, leading her to a different section where doors were spaced further apart. He stopped at a door marked 47 in stenciled numbers, unlocked it, and gestured for her to enter. The cell was identical to the previous one, except it had only 2 cots instead of 4, one for sleeping, one for sitting, or storing the few possessions prisoners accumulated. The high window showed the same view of sky. The walls wept with the same dampness. But the space felt less claustrophobic, with only 1 occupant, rather than 2. Davies set a bucket near the door, standard sanitation equipment, then pointed to the window in the door and spoke slowly in English, supplemented by gestures. "Doctor, later. For you. Check." He mimed examination, pointed to his chest and Clara's, made breathing motions. "Make sure. Pneumonia. You. No." Clara understood. "Doctor." Foster would examine her to ensure she hadn't contracted pneumonia from Inja, that the medical emergency hadn't spread to her through prolonged close contact in inadequate conditions. The concern about her health, the proactive examination rather than waiting to see if she developed symptoms, suggested that preventing illness was priority rather than just treating it after it became crisis. Davies left, locking the door but leaving the viewing plate open. Clara sat on the bunk that wasn't designated for sleeping, held her blankets in her lap, and tried to reorient her understanding of what the door meant. For 3 days, the door had been threat, barrier between her and unknown dangers in corridors beyond her sight. Then, at 3:47 a.m., the door had opened with shouted commands, and terror so acute she'd thought she might vomit from fear. But the door had opened to bring medical help for Inge, to extract her from conditions that were killing her, to provide treatment that offered 60% chance of survival rather than 0. The door was the same. Steel, painted gray, with lock and hinges and viewing plate. But what the door meant was different. Clara sat, holding her blankets, examining this new understanding. Sometimes the door opened not to harm but to help. Sometimes shouted commands meant urgency of rescue rather than aggression. Sometimes guards moving fast were responding to emergency rather than creating one. This wasn't sentiment. This was policy, though Clara wouldn't understand the full framework for days. The British approach to prisoner medical care was codified through Geneva Convention obligations and military regulations that predated the war. The conventions required adequate medical care for prisoners, interpreted by British military as meaning care roughly equivalent to what British soldiers received. Delays in treatment could constitute violations, particularly if delays led to preventable deaths. The policy rested on 4 pillars. First, legal compliance. Prisoners were entitled to medical care, and providing that care was obligation rather than optional kindness. Second, practical efficiency. Healthy prisoners were easier to manage than sick ones, and preventing epidemics protected guards and staff as well as prisoners. Third, intelligence value. Prisoners treated fairly were more cooperative, more likely to provide useful information if interrogated. Fourth, moral imperative. Regardless of nationality or wartime animosity, most British commanders recognized prisoners as human beings deserving basic medical attention. Dr. Margaret Foster embodied this policy through systematic implementation. She was 51, had served in military medical corps since 1939, had treated thousands of wounded soldiers and captured prisoners throughout the war. Her philosophy was documented in facility medical protocols. All patients receive care based on medical need rather than nationality or prisoner status. Delays in treatment for political or administrative reasons are unacceptable. Medical emergencies requiring immediate intervention will be addressed immediately, regardless of hour or convenience. The 3:47 a.m. extraction of Inga Schmidt had followed this protocol exactly. Foster had identified medical emergency during late rounds, had ordered immediate extraction, had coordinated with Sergeant Davies to execute removal quickly. The shouting had been internal communication among British staff, not commands directed at prisoners, but the acoustic reality of shouting near a cell door had created terror. Foster hadn't anticipated or intended. Over the following days, Clara learned the facility's structure through careful observation and Mrs. Hughes's periodic explanations. The facility housed approximately 200 German women, mostly Wehrmacht auxiliary staff like herself, in cells that were being gradually improved as resources allowed. Medical care was centralized in the infirmary, a converted section with proper beds, medical equipment, and Dr. Foster plus 2 nurses. Food was adequate rather than generous. 2 meals daily, approximately 200 calories total, sufficient to prevent starvation, but below the 3,000 calories British soldiers received. Interrogations continued on schedule, twice daily, always during daytime hours, conducted by intelligence officers who asked questions Clara couldn't answer, because her administrative work hadn't involved access to strategic information. The officers seemed frustrated by her lack of useful knowledge, but didn't pressure or threaten beyond repetitive questioning. After the first week, the interrogations decreased to once daily, then to twice weekly, as her interrogators apparently concluded she possessed nothing valuable enough to justify continued time investment. Mrs. Hughes visited daily, bringing updates about Inga. Schmidt's fever broke on day 3. She's responding to antibiotics. Still weak, still requires oxygen support periodically, but prognosis has improved to 80% survival. Dr. Foster expects full recovery if no complications develop. On the 8th day, Hughes brought different news. Schmidt is conscious and asking about you. Dr. Foster approved brief visit. 10 minutes. You'll be escorted to infirmary, supervised during visit, returned to cell afterward. The escort was Corporal Thomas Fletcher, 26, from Cornwall, who spoke no German but communicated through gestures and expressions that suggested basic human decency rather than hostility. He led Clara through corridors she hadn't seen, upstairs to a second floor where the infirmary occupied 3 connected rooms. Ing lay in a proper bed, not a cot, but an actual bed with metal frame and white sheets, with oxygen tubing connected to her nose and IV line in her arm. Her face was pale but no longer flushed with fever. Her breathing was easier, deeper, no longer the shallow gasping that had characterized her final hours in the cell. She smiled weakly when Clara entered. "They saved my life," Inga said quietly, voice hoarse from intubation. "Dr. Foster said I would have died in another 12 hours without treatment. They took me at night because waiting until morning would have been too late." Clara sat in the chair beside the bed, held Inga's hand carefully to avoid dislodging the IV. "I thought, when they shouted and opened the door at night, I thought they were coming to hurt us. I know. I was barely conscious, but I felt your terror. I wanted to tell you it was okay, but I couldn't speak. They carried me so carefully, like I was fragile, like they cared whether they jarred me or caused pain. That's not how you treat prisoners you plan to harm." The 10-minute visit passed quickly. Fletcher indicated time was up through gentle gestures. No force or impatience. Clara squeezed Inga's hand once more, promised to visit again if allowed. Followed Fletcher back to cell 47. Alone again, Clara examined the door from new perspective. The door had opened for medical rescue. The door opened twice daily for food delivery. The door opened for interrogation sessions that were uncomfortable, but not brutal. The door opened for visits to Ing, for medical examinations to ensure Clara wasn't developing pneumonia, for Mrs. Hughes's daily updates. The door opened multiple times daily, and each opening revealed the same pattern. Clara expected threat. Reality delivered something less threatening and sometimes actively helpful. If you're beginning to see how deeply propaganda shaped every corner of this war, and how fragile those illusions were, subscribe now. The full picture is always more complicated than the myths. By the third week, Clara had begun to anticipate door openings rather than dreading them. When footsteps approached at mealtimes, she moved to the door to receive her tray, rather than remaining on her bunk in protective position. When the viewing plate slid open for security checks, she acknowledged the guard with small nod, rather than pretending to be asleep. When Mrs. Hughes arrived for daily updates, Clara asked questions about facility operations and received straightforward answers that suggested information wasn't being withheld strategically. The transformation was gradual, but profound. The door was no longer primarily symbol of threat. It had become symbol of connection, barrier that opened regularly to provide food, information, medical care, human contact. The door still locked from outside, still prevented her from leaving, still represented her captivity. But the door also opened, repeatedly and predictably, demonstrating that isolation wasn't absolute, and that some openings brought help rather than harm. In the fourth week, an incident tested her revised understanding. At 2:30 a.m., the viewing plate slid open. Clara woke to the sound, heart immediately pounding despite weeks of retraining herself about door-related sounds. A voice spoke urgently in English. "Fire drill. Exit cell. Follow corridor lights. Quickly." The door opened. Guards were in the corridor, using flashlights to illuminate the path, shouting instructions Clara couldn't fully understand, but the urgency was clear. Other cell doors were opening, women were filing into the corridor, and the smell of smoke was faint but present. Not immediate danger, but something burning somewhere in the facility. Clara joined the stream of women following guards toward stairwells, down to the ground floor, out into the courtyard where rain was falling steadily. Approximately 200 women gathered in the dark, wet, confused. Guards with flashlights counted them, called out numbers, verified everyone had evacuated. The fire turned out to be minor. Electrical malfunction in a storage room, extinguished quickly by staff before it spread. But the evacuation protocol was taken seriously. Prisoners kept outside for 40 minutes while facility was inspected and declared safe. Clara stood in the rain, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and realized that her first reaction to the door opening at 2:30 a.m. had been fear, but her second reaction, following guards' instructions, trusting that evacuation was necessary rather than trap, had been automatic rather than consciously chosen. She'd learned, gradually and through repeated experience, that doors opening urgently at night could mean rescue or safety, rather than exclusively meaning threat. The learning wasn't complete. Fear remained her first response, but it was no longer her only response. Sergeant Davies appeared beside her, holding a large umbrella. He didn't speak, just positioned himself so the umbrella covered both of them, sharing the small, dry space beneath. They stood like that for perhaps 10 minutes. No conversation because language barrier prevented it, just shared shelter against rain, while waiting for all clear to return inside. When the all clear sounded and prisoners were directed back to cells, Clara found herself walking beside Davies toward the stairs. He gestured to the door they'd just evacuated through, made opening motion with his hands, spoke in slow English. Door opens, sometimes danger out, sometimes safety in. You understand? Clara understood. The door's meaning wasn't fixed. It depended on context, on what existed beyond the door at any given moment. Sometimes staying behind the door was safe, and opening it meant danger. Sometimes staying behind the door was danger, and opening it meant safety. Learning to read context rather than assuming all door openings were threats. That was the skill she was acquiring gradually through experience. By the 5th week, Inga had recovered enough to be released from infirmary. She returned to cell 47, joining Clara in the space that had been converted to 2-person occupancy. Having Inga back transformed the cell from isolated space into shared space, loneliness replaced by companionship, silence replaced by conversation. Inge described her treatment in the infirmary. Dr. Foster visited twice daily, morning and evening. She explained everything: what the medications were, why I needed oxygen, what the timeline for recovery looked like. She answered questions even when I was barely coherent. The nurses, Sister Margaret and Sister Anne, treated me like patient rather than prisoner. When I was frightened or in pain, they stayed and talked until I felt better. They didn't have to do that. They chose to. Clara shared her own experiences. Mrs. Hughes brings daily updates. Sergeant Davies shares his umbrella during fire drills. The door opens multiple times daily, and most openings are helpful rather than threatening. I'm relearning what captivity means. It means we're prisoners, but it doesn't mean we're disposable. There's a difference. In the 6th week, Dr. Foster conducted follow-up examination of Inga, ensuring full recovery. Foster invited Clara to attend, explaining through Mrs. Hughes. Schmidt's recovery was complicated by initial delay in treatment. I want to discuss prevention protocols so similar delays don't occur with other prisoners. In the infirmary examination room, Foster addressed both women through Hughes. Schmidt nearly died because guards misinterpreted Bauer's gestures about illness. We've implemented new protocols. Any prisoner displaying respiratory symptoms must be evaluated by medical staff within 8 hours. Guards have been retrained to recognize symptoms and report immediately. Your near-death experience has changed facility procedures to prevent similar cases. Clara processed this. Inga's pneumonia had been serious enough that facility protocols were revised to prevent recurrence. Prisoners' health mattered enough that systems were adjusted when systems failed. This suggested institutional commitment to medical care rather than just individual doctors or guards choosing to be decent. Foster continued. I also want to explain why extraction occurred at night with urgency that frightened you. Pneumonia deteriorates on specific timeline. Schmidt was approximately 6 hours from respiratory failure that would have been irreversible. Waiting until morning would have meant death. The shouting was time-critical coordination, not aggression. I apologize for the terror it caused, but the urgency was medically necessary. The apology was unexpected. Acknowledgement that rescue had been traumatic despite being necessary. That medical urgency didn't negate psychological impact of midnight extraction. The apology suggested Foster understood prisoners' perspective and cared about their emotional experience even when medical priorities had to take precedence. By the 7th week, the door had become so familiar that Clara could distinguish individual guards by their footsteps. Davies's heavy, measured tread, Fletcher's lighter, quicker pace, Mrs. Hughes's efficient click of practical shoes. Each footfall pattern carried different implications. Davies usually brought food or supervised transfers. Fletcher often escorted to interrogations. Hughes delivered information or facilitated communication. Learning to read these patterns meant Clara could prepare herself appropriately before the viewing plate even opened. Sitting up for food delivery, gathering her thoughts before interrogation, relaxing slightly for Hughes's informational visits. The door remained locked barrier between her and everything beyond. But the barrier had become predictable rather than mysterious. Transparent rather than opaque through accumulated experience. In the 8th week, Mrs. Hughes brought news about repatriation. Preliminary schedules are being arranged. Prisoners will be returned to Germany in groups beginning in September. Medical clearances required before transport. Anyone with ongoing health issues will be held until fully recovered. Inge would be held longer because pneumonia recovery required additional time to ensure no relapse. Clara would likely be in earlier groups, having no medical complications. The prospect of separation was difficult. They'd become close through shared captivity, through Inge's near-death and recovery, through nightly conversations about what awaited in destroyed Germany. What will you tell people? Inge asked one evening. About treatment here? Clara had been contemplating this. The truth. That I was terrified constantly. That conditions were harsh but not deliberately cruel. That guards shouted commands and I thought I would die. But they were rescuing you from pneumonia. That the door opened at night, and I expected violation. But it opened to bring medical care. That propaganda promised one thing, and reality delivered something different. They won't believe you. They'll think you're collaborator or Stockholm Syndrome. Some will believe. Those people matter. On Clara's last evening before repatriation, September 12, 1945, Sergeant Davies found her in the courtyard during evening recreation hour. He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper, spoke through Mrs. Hughes, who'd accompanied him. Something for the journey, and for remembering. Inside were provisions: bread, cheese, dried fruit, chocolate bar, and at the bottom, wrapped separately, was a photograph. Black and white image of the facility's main door, the large steel entrance through which prisoners entered and would eventually exit. On the back, Davies had written in careful English, "Doors open. Sometimes for hard things, sometimes for good things. Remember both." Clara stared at the photograph. The door was just a door. Steel and hinges, locks and handles, no different structurally from millions of other doors. But this particular door had defined her experience, entering through it into captivity, living behind locked cell doors that opened unpredictably, learning gradually that door openings carried multiple meanings rather than single threat. She tried to thank Davies in her limited English. Thank you. For everything. For shouting that night. For saving Ing. For Umbrella. For understanding that doors frighten me. Davies looked uncomfortable with gratitude. Responded through Hughes. Just did job correctly. Doors are doors. We open them when necessary. Lock them when required. Try not to terrify prisoners unless medical emergency requires speed. You survived. Schmidt survived. That's what matters. The journey home took 9 days. Truck to Liverpool, processing through repatriation center, ship to Hamburg, train to what remained of Hamburg city center. Clara carried her small bag with few possessions. Letters from family, clothes received at facility, the provisions from Davies, and the photograph of the door, wrapped carefully to prevent damage. Hamburg was worse than she'd imagined. Entire districts reduced to rubble, people living in basements and makeshift shelters, infrastructure so damaged that normal life was impossible. Her family's building was partially standing. 3 families shared the space that had housed one before the war. Her mother looked ancient, aged decades by 5 years of war. But she wept when Clara appeared at the door, holding her daughter with desperate strength. You survived captivity. How? I survived because British guards shouted, "Open the door," at night, and I thought they were coming to kill me. But they were coming to save my cellmate from pneumonia. Clara unwrapped the photograph, showed her mother the image of the door. This is from the facility. Sergeant Davies gave it to me. He said to remember that doors open for hard things and good things both. Her mother examined the photograph, seeing just a door. Steel, institutional, unremarkable. I don't understand. I spent 2 months locked behind doors, terrified every time they opened because I was certain they'd open to bring harm. They opened hundreds of times. Most times brought food or information or medical care. The door became less frightening through repetition that contradicted my certainty about what doors meant. That's the lesson. Sometimes the thing that terrifies you is mechanism for receiving help, and learning to distinguish danger from rescue requires time and repeated experience. Decades later, in a rebuilt Hamburg apartment, Clara Bauer, remarried after her first husband's death in a construction accident, mother of 2, worked as municipal administrator until retirement, kept a photograph in a frame on her desk. The image showed a steel door, institutional gray, unremarkable except for the story attached to it. Her grandson, 12 and visiting during summer holiday, noticed the photograph one afternoon. "Oma, why do you have a picture of an ugly door? That's weird." Clara was organizing papers, decades of accumulated documents, meticulous records of the administrative work she'd done for 40 years. She set down a folder and picked up the framed photograph, looking at the door she hadn't seen physically in decades, but had never stopped seeing in memory. That door is from when I was prisoner in England. A British sergeant gave me this photograph. He said to remember that doors open for hard things and good things both. The boy looked confused. It's just a door. Doors are never just doors. Every door is potential, for good or bad, for danger or rescue, for isolation or connection. This door was locked when I needed it to be barrier protecting me from things I feared. This door opened when I needed it to open for food and medical care and human contact. The same door. Different meanings depending on what existed beyond it at any given moment. That still sounds weird, Oma. Clara smiled. When you're older, you'll understand. Every time something frightens you, every time you hear shouting or see movement that seems threatening, you'll face choice. Assume the worst based on fear, or wait to see what actually happens based on evidence. I spent 2 months learning that lesson. The door opened hundreds of times. Most times brought help. Fear was real, but predictions weren't always accurate. That lesson, that distinction between fear and reality, is what the door represents. Before you go, subscribe. Because history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember and why. The photograph remained on the desk, the door captured in black and white. Testimony to the night terror was answered with rescue. Clara worked at her desk daily, organizing, filing, maintaining the meticulous records that had defined her career. And each time she looked up, she saw the door. The same door that had terrified her at 3:47 a.m., when guards shouted commands she couldn't understand. The same door that had opened to bring medical care that saved Inga's life. The same door that had opened hundreds of times with food, information, human contact, connection to world beyond locked cell. The measure of civilization isn't found in its weapons or its victories. It's found in doors, how they're used, when they're opened, what purpose their opening serves. It's found in guards who shout urgently because medical emergency requires speed, who apologize later for terror their shouting caused, who share umbrellas during fire drills because shared humanity matters even across lines of nation and captivity. And the measure of healing is found in learning to reinterpret sounds that terrify you, in hearing, "open the door," and learning through repeated experience that opening can mean rescue rather than violation, help rather than harm, connection rather than further isolation. In looking at a photograph of a door decades later and seeing not just steel and hinges, but the accumulation of hundreds of door openings that gradually taught you that fear is real, but reality is more complex, that terror is valid response to uncertainty, but sustained decent treatment eventually creates new understanding. The war had taught millions that doors opening meant danger, that guards shouting meant violence, that captivity meant systematic cruelty. But in a converted factory in Manchester, a different lesson was taught through hundreds of door openings. Sometimes the thing that terrifies you is bringing help. Sometimes urgent shouting means rescue rather than threat. Sometimes the door you fear is the door that saves you. The photograph testified to this truth. Black and white image of institutional door. Reminder that the hardest learning comes from revising certainties that felt absolute. From accepting that the sound of shouting at 3:47 a.m. can mean, "We're coming to save your friend," rather than, "We're coming to harm you." From understanding that doors are never just barriers. They're also thresholds where fear meets reality, and sometimes reality is kinder than fear predicted. Sometimes civilization is measured in doors, in how they're opened, with urgency when medical care requires speed, with care when prisoners are still learning that openings can be safe, in who opens them. Guards who coordinate through shouting but apologize later for the terror their coordination caused. In what comes through when they open. Food and medicine and information, and sometimes just a photograph that says, "Remember that doors have multiple meanings, that the thing that terrified you saved a life, that fear and rescue can arrive through the same opening." The door sat in the photograph, preserved in silver and paper, testament to the truth that sometimes the most important moment of healing is hearing the sound that terrified you, and learning through accumulation of evidence that the sound meant something different than fear predicted. That "open the door," shouted urgently at nearly 4 a.m, can mean doctors are coming to save a life. Guards are coordinating emergency rescue. Doors are opening to bring help rather than harm. That the distinction between danger and rescue isn't always clear from sound alone. That learning to wait for evidence before concluding takes time and repeated safe experiences. That sometimes the mechanism of terror becomes the mechanism of survival, and learning to see both meanings in the same door is the work of months and years. And the photograph that reminds you daily. Doors open, context matters, and sometimes what you fear most is bringing what you need most desperately.